So this talk comes from my PhD research on the rise of maps as a genre of religious images during the Reformation and Mercator's role in this larger cultural phenomenon. When I first started the research on Mercator, I did not anticipate that there would be so much theology because I'm not a theologian, and he's a figure that is so often associated with scientific and mathematical cartography. But Mercator's life spanned the 16th century, so there was really no escaping it. So first, I'll briefly talk about Mercator's legacy as the first scientific cartographer before delving into his biography, with a focus on the impact of the religious conflict on his life. Then I'll spend a good chunk of time providing background on the image controversy, which really set the stage for the rise of sacred geography in Protestant contexts in the first half of the 16th century. We'll finally get around to Mercator's map of the Holy Land and then his map of Europe. These two maps were sought after by some of Mercator's contemporaries, namely Benito Arias Montano, Abraham Ortelius, Guillaume Postel, and Andreas Macias, who all seized the visual capacity of maps in their biblical scholarship. While these map makers who were involved in post-Tridentine counter-Reformation projects like the Antwerp Polyglot Bible, sacred geography took a more scholarly and interpretive turn that was clearly influenced by Mercator's work. And finally, we'll look at Mercator's atlas and how his exegesis on the biblical creation story, which forms the first part of the book, informed the way he created and intended audiences to view the world map that followed. So the legacy of Mercator and his cartography revolve around ideals of objectivity and progressivism, in contrast to preceding Mappamundi, which have historically been described as pictorial, naive, irrational, ideological, and, quote, lacking all the necessary elements to be called true geographical maps, end quote. Mercator's maps have been lauded as mathematical, scientific, modern, and revolutionary. A recent example of this appears in the preface to the digitized English translation of the Atlas, in which it's claimed that Mercator, quote, was not the first to conceive of a book of modern maps, but he can certainly be called the first modern scientific cartographer, end quote. Nicholas Crane's biography adds that Mercator was, quote, the prince of modern geographers, end quote, and the subtitles of two other biographies seen on the screen echo these sentiments. So many of you here are familiar with the history of cartography, and that for about 50 or so years now, scholars have been pushing back against this narrative of objectivity and progressivism by approaching maps as objects embedded with cultural, social, and historical meaning. And yet, as Matthew Edney's recent book, Cartography, The Ideal and Its History shows, is that both our discipline and public perception of maps still struggle to move past these narratives, because of the shape-shifting monolithic cultural ideals and myths that we have about what maps are, what they do, what we do with them, and what they should look like. But even long before this, there were calls to reevaluate the assumptions and expectations of Mercator's map. This was most famously done by Lewis Carroll with Ocean Chart, which accompanied the poem Hunting of the Snark. The map is blank at the center with geographical terminology ordered nonsensically around the edges. The poem reads, quote, he has brought a large map representing the sea without the least vestige of land. And the crew were much pleased when they found it to be a map they could all understand. What's the good of Mercator's North Poles and equators, tropics, zones, and meridian lines? So the bellman would cry, and the crew would reply, they are merely conventional signs. What Carroll's doing is exposing the contradictions and the graphic tensions of the cartographic ideal with which the legacy of Mercator is often associated. So it's not my intention to dismiss or minimize Mercator's contributions to cartography, navigation, and physics, because in his historical moment, scientific and religious inquiry were not at odds. Instead, I'm privileging Mercator's sacred geographies and the way that he and some of his peers used maps to interpret and make visual arguments about long-standing theological positions that were contested during the Reformation. So it's well known that Mercator's long career coincided with one of the most intense periods of religious upheaval in European history. Mercator attended the University of Leuven in 1530, where he studied under the supervision of Gemma Frisius. In Leuven, Mercator made many lifelong friends that would go on to become the century's most famous, most influential scholars, politicians, and religious representatives. Although Leuven attracted unorthodox scholars from all across Europe, the intellectual climate into which Mercator entered was increasingly dogmatic. A decade before Mercator matriculated, the university took one of the earliest stances against Luther. And in 1521, Erasmus, who was a professor of theology there, fled to Basel after being accused as a Lutheran sympathizer by his colleagues. In 1532, when Mercator was just 20 years old, he also left and sought refuge in the more free-thinking city of Antwerp. In the preface to his book, Harmonization of the Gospels, the last book published before his death, he expressed that he was tired by the empty conversations in Leuven and went to Antwerp alone to investigate discrepancies between Moses's and Aristotle's versions of creation. His time in Antwerp was the beginning of his lifelong attempt to reconcile classical and biblical cosmologies, an inquiry likely not well tolerated in Leuven. His biographer, Walter Grimm, tells us that Mercator eventually gave up his philosophical studies and returned to Leuven to engage in work that supported his family, namely map-making and instrument-making. In the spring of 1543, Mercator was arrested, imprisoned, and investigated by the Inquisition for writing suspicious letters to Franciscan friars in Mechelen. Mercator's name appeared on a list of 52 other suspected Lutheran sympathizers compiled by Pierre du Fife for Queen Mary of Hungary, who was then regent in the Low Countries. The formal charges brought against Mercator were that of heresy and Lutheranism. While Mercator was released, likely due to his connections to the university, many others on the list were executed, including a close friend, Johannes Drosius. Mercator wrote little of this experience, only that it was, quote, a most unjust persecution, and that he was, quote, greatly disturbed, unquote. A quote by Ruard Tapper, a senior figure of the Inquisition in the Low Countries and vice-chancellor of the University of Leuven, conveyed the atmosphere at the time. Quote, it is not a great matter whether those that die on this account be guilty or innocent, provided we terrify the people with these examples, which greatly succeeds best, which persons eminent for learning, riches, nobility, or high stations are thus sacrificed. In 1552, Mercator relocated his family to the city of Duisburg in the Duchy of Cleves. He was part of the first wave of migration that began in the 1530s and reached its height in the 1550s. These migrants consisted mostly of Protestant dissenters. The second wave occurred between 1566 and 1572 during the early Dutch Revolt, and a third wave occurred in the middle of the 1580s after the recapture of Calvinist cities by the Spanish Habsburgs. Mercator found further instability in the more tolerant principalities in northwestern Germany. In 1586, at the height of the conflict between Catholics and Protestants in the city of Cologne, Mercator wrote, quote, on all sides we are pressed by war, end quote. The threat of religious violence was a reality Mercator faced his entire adult life. Mercator's religious position has been notoriously difficult to pin down, with various scholars affiliating him with Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism. More recently, scholars have considered that Mercator may have been associated with the Family of Love, a secretive sect, Iranic sect in Antwerp. However, I follow a model put forth by the historian Jason Harris, who resisted placing Mercator's contemporary, Abraham Ortelius, into any religious faction. Harris argues that Ortelius's religious affiliation shifted according to political, religious, and social circumstances, and this seemed to hold true for Mercator too. The auction catalog of Mercator's library indicates that he kept himself abreast of a wide variety of theological perspectives. The catalog, which contains over 1,000 titles, lists several books by reformers, including 1 by Luther, 4 by Erasmus, 7 by Melanchthon, 9 by Calvin, and several by lesser-known Protestants like Theodor Beza, Johannes Brentz, Martin Bucer, Heinrich Bullinger, and more. Many Catholic authors are listed too, including Benito Arias Montano, Rupert Tapper, Johannes Milanus, and Andreas Macias, among others. So you might be able to make out there are little C's and little P's that the transcriber of this put next to each of the titles in order to indicate whether the title was Catholic or Protestant. And there's a good balance of both. And I don't think it's really that clear cut in the 16th century, at least not for all scholars. So the image conflict was central to both Reformation and Counter-Reformation discourses. The art historian David Friedberg succinctly summarized just how pervasive the image question during the 16th century was, and thus Mercator's inability to escape it. Quote, "Whether published in a book or in pamphlet form, whether heard in sermons in the greatest churches, in barns or in open air, few people, regardless of class, would have escaped them, so that everyone had some sense of the image question, and no one would have been left untouched by the grand debate about their institutional, spiritual, economic, or even social status," end quote. Mercator had more than just a sense of the image problem. The controversy over religious images spanned his 60-year-long career. The events that sparked this quandary occurred in early 1522. On January 24th, while Luther was translating the New Testament in hiding at Wartburg Castle, the town council of Wittenberg issued an ordinance to remove images from churches. 3 days after this mandate, when images still hung in houses of worship, Andreas von Karlstadt published a tract entitled On the Removal of Images. Citing Deuteronomy, Karlstadt demanded, quote, "You shall overturn and overthrow their altars. You shall smash their images." Iconoclastic riots took place in Wittenberg in the weeks that followed. Just gonna take some water. Subsequently, a heated debate ensued between the Wittenberg and Leipzig schools, which published tracts that established the main tenets for and against sacred images that would be rehearsed throughout the century. The main oppositional arguments were God was divine and material representations of him were sacrilegious. Images obstructed true devotion because worshipers could mistakenly venerate the image rather than what it represented. Images were abused to make profit, and too much was spent on constructing lavish pictures that could be better used to support the poor. The true meaning of the biblical text was obscured by artists keen on showcasing their talent. And finally, representations of nudity, drunkenness, and monstrous figures were considered lewd and profane. The primary arguments in favor of religious images were Christ's incarnation meant that one could make representations of him. Illiterate audiences learned the scriptures through images, and images were educational tools that strengthened memory and aided in spiritual enlightenment. So Protestants never reached a consensus wholly in favor of or against religious representations, but there has been a long-standing assumption that Lutherans were anti-art because of the Bilderstürme that took place across Germany and Switzerland in the 1520s and 30s. In 1525, Luther published his views on sacred images in a tract entitled Against the Heavenly Prophets in the Matter of Images and Sacraments, in which he condemned, quote, divine and idolatrous images, end quote, which included likenesses of saints and representations of nudity, but promoted images for memorial and witness. So Luther was not anti-art, but rather, in the words of the art historian Joseph Kerner, he, quote, renewed rather than removed religious imagery. That same year, Luther also published his German translation of the Bible with Christopher Froschauer in Zurich. This was the first Protestant Bible to contain a map, which you see here. It depicted the route of the exiled Israelites from Egypt to the Promised Land. It was designed by Hans Holbein the Younger using a model by Lucas Cranach the Elder, who were both key to the development of Lutheran visual culture. As you may have already noted, the map is printed backwards. So in addition to the Exodus map, Cranach designed other maps for Lutheran Bibles he published with Hans Luft. These included a geocentric cosmological map showing God presiding over creation and a map of Daniel's dream depicting the four beasts in the four corners of a pre-discovery world. Similar maps started appearing in vernacular Bibles printed in Antwerp, Geneva, Zurich, Basel, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Uppsala. In their book Maps and Bibles, 1500 to 1600, Catherine Delano Smith and Elizabeth Morley Ingram demonstrate that nearly 20% of Bibles produced during the Reformation included maps. They argued that, quote, the history of maps and Bibles is part of the history of the Reformation, end quote. And they suggested that this developed because of new attitudes towards scripture. Luther exploited maps in his effort to reform religious art because they enabled him to resolve some of the contested issues outlined previously. Woodcut maps were cheap to produce in contrast to costly altarpieces. Maps were clearer and less distracting than the many lavish and provocative images already on display, making them better interpretive tools. Furthermore, some maps, like the Exodus map, facilitated the literal understanding of scriptures promoted by Protestants because they spatially anchored historical events drawn directly from the biblical text. Bibles with maps were abundant during Mercator's time in Antwerp. A study by Paul Arblaster showed that from 1523 to 1545, Antwerp was the center of printing of vernacular Bibles. The Antwerp-based printers Jacob van Liesveld, Wilhelm Forsterman, and Henrik Petersen van Mittelberg all published several editions of Dutch translations of the Bible with Exodus maps. Van Liesveld was the first printer in Antwerp to include a map in his Dutch Bible in 1526. His map appears to be modeled more closely on Froschauer's map than it was Cranach's original, but the image was reversed to correct Froschauer's mistake. In Van Liesveld's map, the route taken by the Israelites from Egypt to Canaan starts in the bottom left, curves around a mountain range, and cuts diagonally through the composition. In the left corner, the parting of the Red Sea is depicted with figures moving through two large waves. Following the path towards Canaan, the viewer arrives at Mount Sinai, where God gave the 10 Commandments to Moses. Moving further towards Canaan, there is a blank spot where a traveler undertakes the difficult journey alone. Following the path to its end, viewers find themselves in the Promised Land, a reward for their unwavering faith during a 40-year-long struggle. So unlike Cranach's map, which only displays latitudinal rulers, and Froschauer's map that displays only longitudinal rulers, Van Liesveld's map included coordinates for both, giving the illusion of precision. To fit this Bible, the map's text was changed from German to Dutch, and the maps in Forsterman's and Petersen's Bibles appear to have been directly copied from Van Liesveld's map, with only small indications that they were printed using separate blocks. As Bibles with maps proliferated during Mercator's time in Antwerp, a pamphlet war over religious images ensued between Thomas More and William Tyndale in that city. It began when Tyndale rendered the Greek word, I can't speak Greek, so I'm going to mispronounce this, idolatrous, as worshiper of images rather than idolaters in his English translation of the New Testament. In doing this, Tyndale launched a broad attack on representations of saints and other divine beings by anchoring an anti-image sentiment in the biblical text. More criticized Tyndale for what he considered a heretical English translation of Erasmus's Greek text. More rehashed familiar arguments in favor of images, writing that, quote, images be the books of lay people wherein they read the life of Christ, end quote. Tyndale too rehearsed earlier arguments claiming that religious images were a waste of money, a distraction from sincere devotion, and that lay people were easily seduced by images and put their trust in them rather than in the saints. Following this dispute, Tyndale's translation of the Bible was published by Miles Coverdale in Antwerp in 1535. Significantly, it included a reoriented and more detailed map of the Exodus, allegedly designed by Holbein. So if the aim of including maps in Bibles was to aid in scriptural interpretation, the fact that they were sometimes carelessly made and lacked detail rendered the images misleading or useless. In the wake of Moore and Tyndale's dispute, Mercator must have noted the serious implications of the way these maps could circulate false ideas about the biblical text while being touted as direct visual translations of scripture. It was the combination of these discrepancies in these maps and the pervasiveness of the image question that set the stage for Mercator's own map of the Holy Land. The Bible maps were extremely successful, and Mercator seems to have perceived a gap in the market. The size of Mercator's Holy Land, its Latin inscriptions, and the level of clarity in the detailed engraving suggests it was directed for a wealthier and more erudite audience in Lothian. Mercator oriented his map with northwest at the top to minimize what he called useless space. Mercator's coordinate frame is unusual insofar as it includes longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates in parallel columns on all sides of the map, which seems to have been done to maintain visual clarity and make it easier to read. The lands of Egypt in the far left, Arabia in the center, and Palestine in the upper right corner are framed by the Mediterranean Sea across the top, the Red Sea in the left corner, and a large explanatory cartouche in the bottom right. Orienting the map with northeast at the top allowed Mercator to give prominence to the Exodus route, which twists and turns across the entire scene. It also created a composition in which the entire Exodus story could be easily read from left to right. Like Bible maps, Mercator provided viewers with a pre-marked path to follow along in the flight of the Israelites. The path was composed of parallel dotted lines and labeled with numbers 1 to 40, representing the 40 years the Israelites wandered in the desert. The numbers along the path correspond to a list of place names in a large cartouche in the bottom right corner. These derive from chapter 33 of the Book of Numbers and represent the sacred places through which the Israelites passed. Each is accompanied by a brief description of events that took place there, prompting the viewer-reader to scriptural passages. The route begins at the center right, marked 1. From there, the path extends southeast around a mountain range between 3 and 4, through the parted Red Sea between 4 and 5, and then east to Mount Sinai, labeled 12. There, a haloed figure radiating from the mountaintop and a figure standing below depicts Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God. The path turns, stretching through the Arabian mountains, where Mercator has grouped the place names numbered 15 to 19, and the notation positions of places unknown. He also grouped place names 21 through 25, labeling them marks uncertain. The road circles on itself following Holbein's loop rather than Cronach's jagged one. The path makes another downward turn before changing directions for the last time to end in the promised land labeled Palestina. This step-by-step visual journey that Mercator illustrated invites the viewer to meditate on the Israelites' struggle by imaginatively embarking on their exile and reaping the reward for their unwavering faith. On the map, Mercator noted that he drew directly from the data of Jakob Siegler, an itinerant German cartographer and theologian who published a popular geographical work that contained 5 maps of the Holy Land, as well as extensive coordinate lists. It's evident from discrepancies in the 2 maps that Mercator relied more on Siegler's data than his images. Curiously, like Holbein's version, Mercator's path loops where the unknown locations of 10 stations were marked. Mercator appears to have made rigorous comparisons between all available sources, including visual, coordinate list, and scriptural passages. He was determined to make the map as accurate as possible and as clear as possible so that it could better serve its didactic purpose. Mercator's map stood apart from Bible maps because of his meticulous research, clarity of design, comprehensive detail of the geographical and scriptural loci of the Exodus, and layering of the historical events that occurred in this sacred landscape. Mercator demonstrated the same fastidiousness in the research and design of his map called the Description of Europe, which incorporated the itineraries of the Israelites, Jesus, St. Paul, and St. Peter. So Description of Europe is an enormous 15-sheet engraved wall map dedicated to Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, a politician and leader in the Catholic Church. It was published in 1554 in Duisburg, and because of its popularity, again in 1572 by Plantin in Antwerp. In this map, Mercator imagined the physical landscape and community of Europe as stretching from Iceland in the top left corner to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea in the bottom right. A large cartouche in the top left contains a lengthy text about the geographical position of Europe and references to historical and contemporary sources used. Mercator explained that it was necessary to create a new map of Europe because he found that it was not adequately depicted in Spanish and Portuguese portolan charts, or in versions of Ptolemy's geography that he consulted, and he had about 5 or 6 that are listed in that library inventory. While he acknowledged his debt to these sources, he also noted that he, quote, carefully compared all their errors, end quote, in order to correct them. Scales, grids, and numerous cartouches with texts describing the itineraries of Jesus, St. Peter, and St. Paul draw the viewer away from the impeccably detailed picture of Europe to instruct them on how to engage with the map. The cartouche in the top right corner provides an itinerary of the peregrinations of St. Paul, who after his conversion to Christianity on the road to Damascus spent his life on a proselytizing mission, traveling as far as Rome. Mercator speculated that Paul may have traveled beyond Rome, writing, quote, there are those who think that he visited Spain and Gaul, freeing them from their chains, end quote. Another small cartouche below this describes the life of St. Peter, a missionary who Mercator described as having joined Paul in Rome, where they were martyred by the Roman Emperor Nero. The peregrinations of Christ are detailed in the bottom right corner. Unlike the itineraries of Peter and Paul, Mercator included references that pointed directly back to biblical passages. The Exodus route is also shown as a path extending from Ramses to Jericho. By bringing these historical pilgrimages into the contemporary picture of Europe, Mercator attempted to represent Europe as unified through a common Christian heritage. Moreover, he succeeded in representing the lives of the saints without depicting their likeness. So unlike the path of the Israelites that is shown on this map and described in detail in the Holy Land, Mercator did not provide a pre-marked path for Christ or the apostles, which was the result of both missing information and conflicting interpretations. Instead, Mercator provides viewers with the tools to chart the paths themselves. Description of Europe contains 12 different mileage systems. A pair of compasses draw the eye above to the text above, which explains that multiple scales were included because Europe lacked a common system of measurement, and therefore knowledge of more than one could help the traveler compute between different systems. Mercator also explained that this map comes in handy when mileage markers on the road have been destroyed, but since this map is large and would have been expensive, it's unlikely that it would have actually been used in transit. A closer inspection of the map's border confirms that this map is framed in terms of movement. The ornate frame composed of grotesque designs depict bizarre combinations of rowers, chariot pullers, snails, and wheels, bringing together different modes, paces, and directions of travel. The compasses also invite viewers to measure the map with their own tools. By including multiple mileage scales, which were not standardized, diverse audiences all over Europe could trace the peregrinations of Peter, Paul, and Christ using measurements familiar to them. Since Mercator did not provide a clear path for his audience, and they were expected to chart this journey themselves, the scales not only served to negotiate between different understandings of space, but also to accommodate different interpretations of the Holy Word. In other words, Mercator purposely designed this map in a manner that invited multiple perspectives, when in many of the real spaces around him, he was forced into religious conformity. The evidence from the Plantin Archives in Antwerp shows that these two maps, the Holy Land and description of Europe, were highly sought after. Mercator's Europe first appeared in the records of the Plantin Press in 1558, when Plantin ordered 4 copies. Dirk Imhoff's research demonstrated that between 1564 and 1599, Plantin and his successor, Jan Moretus, purchased 1,097 maps and 22 sets of globes made by Mercator. Description of Europe was the most popular work. In one delivery alone, Mercator shipped 206 maps of Europe to Plantin. In total, Plantin sold 316 copies of the original 1554 version and 88 copies of his 1572 reprint. In the study, Imhoff revealed that Plantin purchased more than 100 copies of Mercator's Holy Land at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 1568, just prior to Benito Arias Montano's arrival in Antwerp to work on the Polyglot Bible. So Mercator's maps were particularly sought after by the scholars that contributed to the Antwerp Polyglot Bible. So that's Montano, Macias, Postel, and Ortelius. The Council of Trent set the context for why sacred geography flourished in the Counter-Reformation context and why Mercator's maps were so attractive to the scholars behind the Polyglot Bible. The Council of Trent met 25 times between 1545 and 1563 to establish the official position of the Catholic Church on various doctrinal points and to define the heresies committed by its Protestant opponents. In the Council's final session, sacred images were discussed. The Council saw the need to address the growing image problem with a decree entitled On the Invocation, Veneration, and Relics of Saints and on Sacred Images, which defended the veneration of saints as a necessary article of faith and stressed the pedagogical purpose of religious images. Art historian Valerie Hermans summarized the Church's official position, which rested on three pillars: the doctrinal correctness of the image, its decorum, and finally, invigilation. Montano, who attended the meetings at Trent, saw the potential of maps to meet the objectives of the decree and was drawn to Mercator's maps for the ways in which they seemed to uphold the Council's position in terms of their detail, clarity, and direct references to Scripture. Geographia Sacra, or sacred geography, was coined by Benito Arias Montano, who first used it in the Polyglot Bible published by Christopher Plantin. The Polyglot Bible was an 8-volume Bible overseen by Montano between 1568 and 1572. Created in the wake of the Council of Trent, it was a symbolic undertaking that sought to, quote, demonstrate the piety of King Philip and his fervor of the Catholic faith, end quote, as Plantin wrote in the introduction. The first 4.5 books contain the Old and New Testaments in 5 languages. The last 3.5 are comprised of a sacred apparatus, which is a critical appendix containing commentary, dictionaries, and illustrations. Among the illustrations were a map of Canaan with the Exodus route, modeled off one Montano acquired in Trent, one of Canaan after the Hebrew conquest, a map of antique Jerusalem, and a double hemisphere world map illustrating the migration of Noah's progeny to the New World, which I'll come back to in a moment. Montana's inclusion of maps in the Polyglot Bible has been considered a direct response to Protestant Bibles that had flooded the market. Plantin's stockpile of Mercator's maps and globes piqued Montano's interest. In 1568, Plantin advertised a Mercator globe to Montano. 2 years later, Plantin dispatched 2 globes together with a small number of wall maps to Spain on Montano's account. At the end of 1571, 2 copies of Mercator's Europe were added to Montano's account at the Plantin Press. Andreas Macias worked as an ambassador for William V, Duke of Jülich, Cleves, and Berg, who was also Mercator's patron, and he worked at the Curia in Rome. In 1563, Macias wrote to George Cassander, a mutual friend and neighbor of Mercator's, requesting topographical information about the Holy Land for his forthcoming commentary on Joshua. Specifically, Macias wished to know the locations of Mount Gerizim and Abel. In a follow-up letter addressed to Cassander, Macias expressed his desire to obtain Mercator's Holy Land map, which Mercator later sent him. In a letter to Macias in 1567, Mercator further expounded his thoughts on the geography of the Holy Land and reminded him of a similar exchange they had a few years prior. In 1574, Plantin published Macias's History of Emperor Joshua, a polyglot commentary on the Book of Joshua. Not only is this listed in the catalog of Mercator's library, but it includes a small map with references to Mercator's expertise on the geography of the region. Guillaume Postel's connection to Mercator is a bit more obscure. Postel was a skilled linguist, avid Kabbalist, and famous heretic in his own time. And he demonstrated keen interest in sacred geographies before his work on the Polyglot Bible. Postel's insistence that Ortelius's Theater of the World was, quote, the most important book since the Bible, end quote, exemplifies that he placed value in the study of sacred geography for a better understanding of the biblical text. Postel wrote several tracts on paradise, devised a Holy Land map that was used for French and English translations of the Bible published in Geneva, and designed a world map with the North Pole at the center, visualizing his hypothesis that paradise was at the North Pole. Given that Postel's correspondence is lost and Mercator's is sparse, the relationship between the two remains enigmatic. Most scholars have tentatively reconstructed their relationship based on shared connections with Montano, Macias, Ortelius, and John Dee. But the fact that Mercator's library lists 4 titles by Postel signals that he was quite familiar with his work. And finally, Mercator's influence on Ortelius's sacred geography should not be underestimated. The art historian Walter Melian argued that Montana was responsible for spurring Ortelius's creation of biblical maps, but it's evident that Mercator's depictions of sacred landscapes served as important models as well. In 1579, Ortelius published an appendix to his mapbook Theater of the World, originally published in 1570. It included at least 5 maps on sacred history, and Mercator's influence is obvious. For example, one of Ortelius's maps illustrated the peregrinations of St. Paul, and a citation indicates it was, quote, based on the map of Europe made by Gerhard Mercator, unquote. Like Mercator, Ortelius did not provide a path, but rather included references to biblical passages so that viewers could chart St. Paul's journey themselves. All of this evidence indicates that Mercator's religious maps were key sources and models for Montano, Macias, Postel, and Ortelius, who have all been considered central to the development of sacred geography in the 16th century. So my last example comes from Mercator's Atlas, or Cosmographical Meditations on the Fabric of the World and the Image of the World Made, published posthumously by his sons in 1595. It was the first map book to use the name of the Greek Titan as its title. In the frontispiece, Mercator refigured the traditional iconography of Atlas. Conventionally, Atlas was depicted bearing a globe of the heavens on his shoulders, as in Antonio Lafferty's Geographia, which was the first map book to use the mythological figure on its frontispiece. Conversely, Mercator's frontispiece depicted Atlas making and measuring a pair of terrestrial and celestial globes. This iconography echoed medieval images of God as the architect of the world. Mercator's engraving combined biblical and classical topoi, representing the divergent cosmologies of scripture and antiquity, to show the Greek God making images of the universe. In doing this, the frontispiece visually introduces the aims of Mercator's book. The first was to harmonize the scriptural and the classical theories of the universe in order to construct a new concept of the world that reconciled these existing models. By introducing Atlas as a maker of images, Mercator foregrounded his second aim, which was to showcase himself as a self-conscious image maker, reflecting his serious engagement with contemporary discourses on sacred imagery. The Atlas is composed of 2 main parts, a commentary on Genesis called The Creation and the Fabric of the World, and 107 maps. It also includes several dedications, letters, and a biography of Mercator by his neighbor and mayor of Duisburg, Walter Gimm. A key question motivating my investigation of the Atlas was why the treatise and map had rarely been examined together when Mercator clearly intended his cosmological text to frame the way audiences engaged with the maps that followed, particularly the world map. The separation of Mercator's treatise and maps has obscured his original intent of the Atlas and has therefore divorced the maps from their broader cultural context. The treatise on the first 2 chapters of Genesis is a metaphysical text in which Mercator puts forth ideas about God's creation of time, space, matter, as well as a set of universal laws governing creation. The text is divided into 22 chapters. The first chapter argues that the aim of all cosmology was to demonstrate that God's providence, wisdom, and goodness could be seen in the composition of the world he created. He drew the viewer's attention to his map by inviting, quote, anyone to whom his wisdom and goodness is not yet fully evident, to examine fully with us until the very contemplation of the work perceived on every side, so far as is allowable from the word of God itself and the manifest experience of things, persuade him, end quote. The second chapter delineates the Platonic philosophy of creation. Mercator described the Platonists as, quote, approaching most closely the truth of the tradition of Moses. But his aim was to highlight where they erred from the biblical text. The third chapter laid out Mercator's interpretation of the Trinity doctrine, which he understood to be, quote, a form of triple reason, end quote, that governed God's creation of the universe and sustained the natural world. 17 of the 19 subsequent chapters provided commentary on the creation of light, motion, and the separation of the terrestrial and celestial realms. Chapter 18 deals with the fall of Adam and Eve, and chapter 19 discusses salvation through Christ as the blessing God granted humans after the fall. So this map, entitled Compendious Description of Earth, was completed by Mercator's son, Romuald, in 1595. But the title cartouche explains that it was modeled off one entitled Great Universe that his father created for Lord Richard Garth. The original map is not known today. Mercator's cosmological text is summarized by his son at the bottom of the map, further indicating that the text and map worked in tandem. The conclusion to this summary reads, quote, I wish to call attention briefly to these lucubrations of my father on his cosmography, so that the reader might be imbued with natural speculations on the globe and might attain entry into the deeper mysteries of its foundation, end quote. This remark tells us that the world map was designed to induce contemplation about God's creation of the world, thereby implying that contemporary geographical knowledge could lend itself to a better understanding of Genesis. European encounters with the New World, Nicholas Copernicus's hypothesis of a heliocentric universe, and Tycho Brahe's theory of a mutable cosmos all posed challenges to the chief cosmological models that Mercator addresses. So centered directly below the title and sandwiched between the hemispheres is a small armillary sphere depicting the Ptolemaic celestial system. The theoretical principles at the crux of this disproven cosmological system posited that the universe was geocentric and fixed. By including this, Mercator upheld the immutable geocentric model of the cosmos and took an explicit stance against Copernicus and Brahe's theories. And it should be noted that I think it's the University of Glasgow that has an annotated copy of Copernicus's book, annotated by Mercator. So Mercator was not the first to illustrate Genesis with a map, but he diverged from previous traditions by using a world map to depict Genesis chapter 1, which describes the story of creation, rather than Genesis chapter 10, which delineates the repopulation of Earth by Noah's progeny after the flood. Mercator's map seems to have been a response to Montano's world map from the Polyglot Bible, which constituted one of the few examples of a double hemispheric map from the period. Montano designed this world map to address the question of how Noah's descendants arrived in the New World. The political underpinning of this type of projection was first established by Franciscus Monachus. A double hemispheric map appeared on the frontispiece to his book On the Situation and Description of the Earth, published in 1527. The map displays the Old and New Worlds as the Spanish and Portuguese territorial claims established in the treaties of Tordesillas and Zaragoza. Montano's world map was the first of its kind to appear in a Bible, and it was directly modeled off the world map of Ruscelli's 1561 edition of Ptolemy's geography. Significantly, Montano removed the coordinate grid from his image, a decision that stripped the map of any mathematical illusion, which allowed him to visually highlight his argument. Within the Polyglot Bible, Montano's map was preceded by a commentary on the migration of Noah's ancestors across the world after the flood. In the map, Montano marked Hebrew settlements in the Old and New Worlds with letters and numerals. These digits relate back to the map's 5 keys in cartouches in the margins, which provide the names of each settlement. The density of settlements decreases as one moves farther from the Holy Land and into territories less explored by Europeans. For example, only a few sites are interspersed in Central and Southern Africa and in the Americas. Montano maintained that the Americas were settled by the descendants of Shem, arguing that Shem's progeny arrived in the New World via a land bridge that connected northeastern Asia and North America. This is shown on the map with 3 Hebrew settlements in the New World, marked 19, 21, and 22. Montano's theory differed significantly from Mercator's hypothesis that, quote, mankind traveled thither after the age of Christ and the apostles, end quote. This hypothesis also diverged from the positions of Postel and Ortelius, who theorized that Amerindians were descendants of the 10 lost tribes who were part of the 12 original tribes that settled the Holy Land. Pamela Brecker argued that that the images included in the Polyglot Bible were designed to support the imperial agenda of the king. This is exemplified in Montano's map, as it shows ancient Hebrew settlements in the New World in locations under Spanish control. Looking at Montano's map from this perspective sheds light on why Mercator was compelled to respond with a map of his own. While Montano exploited the historical tradition of mapping the settlements of Noah's descendants to bolster King Philip's utopic dream of world domination, Mercator wielded it to make bold claims about the biblical creation story. So it was not only the existence of humans in the New World that tested the authority of the Bible, but also evidence of vastly different biospheres. Plant and animal species native to the Americas were regularly brought back to Europe. They were collected and displayed in botanical gardens and curiosity cabinets for comparison with their European relatives. Lord Garth, Mercator's original dedicee for this map, had one such curiosity cabinet. The differences between plant and animal species in the Old and New World led Mercator to propose an unusual theory about the nature of the pre- and post-flood worlds. He explained, from what we have said, you may have gathered that some grasses, trees, and that were created in some regions, others in others. Experience, too, teaches that some exist in America or New India that are never found in our continent, that is Asia, Africa, and Europe. Likewise, there are animals that are not found in our continent, which certainly existed from the creation of the world. From this, I suspect that those lands were not destroyed by the flood, since God wished to destroy mankind. For there were no men there, and the animals created and dwelling there were not destroyed on account of a cause not found in animals, namely that man, who God repented creating, would perish. But in our continent, the animals should have perished unless some have been saved in the ark, since they could not live in water, unquote. To Mercator, evidence of different plant and animal species on the 2 continents was proof that the New World was the same as it had been at the time of creation. The natural environment of the New World that had existed prior to the flood had not been destroyed as the old worlds had. According to Mercator, before the deluge, humans only occupied Asia, Africa, and Europe. Since God was only interested in destroying humankind for its sins and not all of creation, his flooding was limited to the old world. This stood in direct contrast to the prevailing notion that the deluge completely transformed God's perfect and uncorrupted earth, which rendered the antediluvian world unrecognizable. Moreover, Mercator's insistence that the continents were hollowed out by God at the time of creation was significant because it meant that the contemporary state of the world retained remnants of God's original creation, and therefore of God himself. In contrast to Montano, Mercator wielded his world map to reveal something about God's architectural plan rather than a historical or future plan for occupation. The book of Genesis captured the imaginations of many reformers, including Luther, Melanchthon, and Calvin, all of whom wrote commentaries on the subject. But it was Calvin's commentary on the first book of Moses, which Mercator owned, that seems to have made the greatest impression on Mercator's view of religious images. Calvin exclaimed that creation was God's image, writing that, quote, "For God, by other means invisible, clothes himself, so to speak, with the image of the world, in which we would present himself to our contemplation," end quote. Calvin cited creation as an example of a living image, which stood in contrast to images that were created, which he understood to be images that were created by God and that revealed something of God's inner nature. This stood in contrast to the concept of dead images, which were, quote, "made of wood and stone," end quote, and admitted to Christian temples when the pastors have become dumb and have been converted into mere idol. In his commentary on Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, Calvin wielded this visual metaphor of the universe again, arguing that, quote, "In the whole architecture of this world, God has given us clear evidence of his eternal wisdom, goodness, and power. And though he is invisible in himself, he shows himself to us in some measure in his work. The world is therefore rightly called a mirror of divinity," end quote. In other words, God, who is otherwise invisible, made himself visible through the structure, laws, and patterns in the universe. Calvin insisted that, quote, "man was formed to be a spectator of the created world, and that he was endowed with eyes for the purpose of his being led to God himself, the author of the world, by contemplating this magnificent image," end quote. The opening passage of Mercator's commentary makes his engagement with Calvin's ideas evident. Mercator wrote, quote, "For any mind considering the construction of this earthly machine, it is axiomatic that God, its author, is of immeasurable power, wisdom, and goodness," end quote. He invited skeptics to examine the composition of the world's fabric so that he, quote, "he may be always raised up to the veneration of his majesty." In essence, this map of the world is Mercator's image of God. So to conclude, maps offer a view into the visual world of the past. And while geography has been theologically oriented, or was theologically oriented long before the 16th century, sacred geography emerged as an important visual genre during the 16th century image debates, which sought to differentiate proper images from those that transgressed new definitions of acceptability. Maps thrived in both Reformation and Counter-Reformation contexts and were wielded as visual aids, didactic tools, and exegetical imagery. Mercator's work served as a bridge in the division over religious imageries that largely followed confessional lines. And as I tried to show throughout the presentation, sacred geographers designed maps to address a range of contested theological subjects. While Mercator is rightly lauded for his contributions to scientific map making, his maps, like all maps, are the product of human making, shaped by the cultural and intellectual conditions of his time. Thank you. All right, questions?
All right, we have time for maybe one and a half questions.
Thank you. I was wondering if you had any knowledge on the tools that were being used at that time, whether it was pre-sextant, what have you, for the physical measurements of the positioning.
So they were using triangulation. I don't know all of the physical tools that they were using, but Gemma Frisius published a book on triangulation with images and examples about how land could be measured. So if you were standing at the top of a tower in a town, then you could sort of measure the distance to a new town. And so he was Mercator's mentor, so I assume that he was familiar with that book. But Mercator, throughout his work, he shows that he is consulting historical data, so sets of coordinates. He's looking at Portolan charts, so he's comparing a lot of Portolan charts. He's comparing images of Ptolemaic maps, and he actually published Ptolemy's geography with new maps, new corrected maps. But he left no mathematical proofs behind, so it's really hard to kind of figure out exactly what his process was. Maybe somebody knows more.
Since it was the Reformation and many churches or religions peeled off from Catholicism, did the cartographers have to pick sides?
Yeah.
Did they go into it as just straight up businessmen, or was it theologically driven?
I think there were a lot of reasons for making maps, because this is also a period of colonization, the age of discovery, right? So they're also making maps for navigation. I think that in some contexts, people were sort of forced to choose sides. But Mercator, because of where he moved and the circle of friends and peers that he was associated with were also, evangelicals who didn't necessarily pick a side. They were really they were kind of creating their own ideas, right? Having a personal relationship with God, which is something that we consider in Protestant contexts today. So I think it depends upon the context and when during the Reformation.
Sorry, we'll count the first two as.
Non-questions.
So, my question was, at this time in the 16th century, as you suggested, religion shaped a lot of the cartography within the maps, and especially a lot of the images. But at this time, like you had Copernicus and you had other map makers and other, intelligent people of that time kind of pushing back with other ideas. And I referenced, I was just showing Kay here, there's a map by Munster and Holbein that has angels at the top and bottom of the map with cranks, and they're effectively spinning the earth to suggest that that's how we see the stars across our skies, is that the earth is spinning within the universe and not the universe spinning around it, which kind of goes against, Mercator's depiction at the top. Would you say that Mercator was kind of consistently on the side of the church and kind of pushing it back against those other ideas, and some of the other map makers in a lot of his works?
I think that there are maps of his that aren't religious, right? They are, and some of those are included in the atlas, where he's encouraging people, like, send me data about these towns I don't know about. So essentially what he was trying to do is incorporate the new empirical knowledge or data, and to try to find a way that it didn't conflict with the Bible. And Copernicus, and that I go into a little bit more in my PhD. So he was writing his theories, publishing his theories long before he published the book. And there were several reactions against the sort of jumpstart scientist who's trying to challenge the Bible. And obviously, he's rejected throughout the 16th century in certain communities. So I don't think it's fair to say that everyone's against new empirical data, but in many contexts, religion or the Bible, Christianity was shaping the way that the knowledge was interpreted or the data was interpreted.
Wonderful.
Well, another question, just to sort of answer.
Yes, please.
Help you answer that two questions. About a decade ago, I did a talk here on Ortelius, So I will say that in terms of, both Mercator and our friends that time had to move around a lot
Mhm.
to stay away from hostile church authorities at those
Yep.
times.
And Plantin did as well. So, Plantin fled Antwerp. Fled Antwerp because he was accused of printing Protestant material, right? So he fled Antwerp, went to Paris, came back, and then kind of made alliances with the Spanish Habsburgs at the time. So a lot of these people were just kind of, shape-shifting, and keeping their real views to themselves, whether it's in letters, in publications. So it's really hard to, and that's why it's so hard to like pin down Mercator or Ortelius's religious position, because they did not want to be forthcoming about this information, for fear of being persecuted.
All right, let's thank Daniel one more time. We'll see all 50 plus of you next month.
Definitely 51.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Anybody uses that dual globe projection, it's kind of like the last,
Mhm.
it's an interesting projection. Because it incorporates, in a way, it gets rid of some of the distortions on the traditional Mercator map.
Yep.
Because Greenland is too big, and do you know what I mean? All those things, and I was saying,
Mhm.
I use a GIS program for different things, and I don't think I've ever seen, the dual worlds